Chapter 1. The Call of Moses. Between the palace shadow and the desert dawn. In the scorching sands of the Sinai desert, where the unyielding wind was the sole sovereign and carried only echoes of past, long-forgotten generations on its wings, Moses tended the flocks of his father-in-law, Jethro. These were not merely 40 years of exile. This was a stage of sacred purification, a furnace of transformation in which the former Egyptian prince, who knew the weight of gold and the arrogance of power, became a humble shepherd, knowing only the weight of his staff and the peril of the mountain paths. His soul, once torn between two worlds, the Egyptian splendor and the Hebrew sorrow, had found deceptive peace in this boundless silence. He thought he had fled destiny, hidden from a great, insurmountable responsibility, concealing his history behind the yellow dunes. But the tranquility of nature was precisely deceptive, for destiny does not ask permission. It waits until its chosen one is ready. And so, at the foot of the sacred Mount Horeb, where the air was particularly charged, the silence suddenly and catastrophically broke. Moses saw it. It was not a common spontaneous combustion from the heat or lightning. It was fire that contradicted itself, a fire that burned but did not consume. The thorn bush stood in a fiery halo, gleaming and pulsing with red-gold light against the gray stone, yet never turning to ash. This was a violation of physical law, an intervention of the transcendent into the world of the temporary. Moses, a man of the desert, knew what fire was, and that is precisely why a sacred, paralyzing terror seized him. As he cautiously approached, driven by an irresistible curiosity, a voice sounded from the heart of the non-consuming flame. It was not the intimidating voice of thunder, nor the enticing whisper of the wind. It was a sound so pure and primal, so powerful and personal, that it penetrated straight into the marrow of his bones, splitting his doubt and exposing his fear. "Moses! Moses!" it rang out. The address by name, personal and distinct, tore through the 40-year veil of solitude. And Moses' first instinctive reaction, steeped in reverence for the gods, was to fall prostrate. The voice sounded again, placing upon him the burden he had so long avoided. "Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground." To remove his shoes was to cast off the dust of the world and acknowledge himself as one entering the sphere of the absolute. And then Moses heard the greatest mystery articulated in words. "I am Yahweh. I am that I am, the existing one." This was not the name of a sun god or a river god. It was the proclamation of pure, eternal, unchanging being. Pharaoh, who considered himself a god, was merely a passing ruler over sand. But this was the voice of the one who stands outside of time. And then, the command, simple as a breath, and heavy as mountains. "I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard their groaning. I have come down to rescue them. Go and bring my people out." Suddenly, Moses, the shepherd, became the intermediary between eternity and history. All his past achievements, his knowledge, even his act of killing the Egyptian, all acquired a new, terrifying meaning. Now he had to return to where he was a criminal, to the palace where he was a prince, to the people he had abandoned, return to lead them into the unknown. His heart tightened with the realization that the peace of the desert was an illusion, and true life awaited him in the crucible of battle. He felt not just fear of Pharaoh, but a metaphysical dread of his own calling. Chapter 2. Signs and Doubts. the psychological battle of the intermediary. God promised Moses not only strength, but his very self. The bush that burned but was not consumed was only the beginning, a visual confirmation of the impossible. Yet this sign did not lift the burden of human doubt from Moses. On the contrary, it only emphasized the terrible chasm between the grandeur of the calling and his own insignificance. "Who am I, Lord, that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt?" His words were not merely an excuse, but the cry of a soul conscious of its fragility. His doubts were multi-layered, like a pyramid, self-doubt. His difficulty in speaking, his stutter, his former status as a murderous fugitive, doubt in the people. "They will not believe me. They will ask, 'What is his name?' And doubt in the task. The fear of Pharaoh was not fear of a man, but fear of embodied idolatrous power, of the God-King. He knew that Pharaoh's heart was stone, and that the darkness of slavery had engulfed the spirit of the Israelites so much that they no longer desired freedom, but only guaranteed rations. And then God, with a love that knows no refusal, but also a demand that knows no compromise, gave Moses signs. These were not mere tricks for the crowd, but psychological tools intended to convince Moses himself first and foremost. "What is that in your hand?" the voice asked. The shepherd's staff, the symbol of his peaceful, escaped life, instantly turned into a hissing, deadly, poisonous serpent. Moses, who was afraid and recoiled, received his first lesson. The simplest tool in the hand of faith becomes an instrument of cosmic power. He had to grasp the serpent by its tail, plunging his hand into the sphere of risk to restore it to the shape of wood. The second sign was even more personal and horrifying. God commanded him to put his hand inside his cloak. When Moses drew it out, it was white as snow, stricken with a terrifying mortal leprosy. This was a visualization of what could happen to his people if he did not intervene, and a reminder of his own mortality. When the hand became healthy again, Moses understood. The power that grants disease can grant healing. The power that carries death also carries life. Despite these signs, his doubt about eloquence remained. "Oh, my Lord, I am not a man of words." This declaration concealed not only a speech impediment, but a deeper fear, the fear of speaking truth to power. God reproached him. "Who gave human beings their mouths? Who makes them deaf or mute? Is it not I, the Lord?" This was the ultimate argument. If God commands him to speak, he will also give the word. But, seeing the stubbornness of his servant, he made one last merciful compromise. Aaron, his brother, would become his mouth, his voice. From this moment, Moses accepted his destiny. He was chosen not because of his strength, but because of his weakness, which allowed the divine power to act through him. He received the task, the staff, the name of God, and a brother. Filled with heavy resolve, not triumph, he left the mountains. He went not toward freedom, but toward the greatest confrontation in history. His path led to the heart of darkness, where Pharaoh awaited. Chapter 3. Distortion and resistance. The clash of two wills in marble halls. Moses, armed only with a simple shepherd's staff and the great unique name, stood before Pharaoh in his marble halls, where the air was heavy with incense and the walls gleamed with gold. This was a clash of two realities: the grandeur of the desert and the grandeur of the empire, the voice of eternity and the whisper of pride. Moses stood not as a petitioner, not as a slave, but as an emissary, the herald of God, whose appearance, despite his humble attire, radiated authority. "Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, let my people go," thundered Aaron's voice, amplified by Moses' spirit, shattering the palace silence. Pharaoh, sitting on his throne adorned with the symbols of Ra and Amun, felt not fear, but only wrath. Who was this Yahweh, and why should he obey him? Pharaoh was a god on earth, the living embodiment of divinity. His heart was stone, not because God compelled him, but because he himself decided that his will was the supreme and only one. His response was full of contempt. "Who is the Lord, that I should obey his voice and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and I will not let Israel go." These words were not just a refusal, but a declaration of war against heaven. Pharaoh embodied human pride, which refuses to acknowledge any authority higher than its own. He saw in Moses only a rebellious slave who dared to interrupt his divine tranquility. Moses' initial signs, such as the staff turning into a serpent, were met with mockery. The Egyptian magicians could do the same, albeit with less power. This was the triumph of illusion over reality, and it only strengthened Pharaoh in his obstinacy. His wrath and stubbornness increased, and he responded to the call for freedom with a new, terrible irony. He not only refused liberation, but doubled the burden of slavery. "You are lazy. You talk about your gods because you have nothing to do. From now on, do not give them straw. Let them gather it themselves, and the quota of bricks remains unchanged." This was a distortion that inflicted a double blow on the Israelites. Physical, the work became unbearable, and psychological, they hated Moses. The people for whom he had returned poured their anger upon him, accusing him of worsening their plight. "May the Lord look on you and judge you. You have made us repulsive in the eyes of Pharaoh." Moses, devastated, returned to God with a cry. "Why have you sent me? Since I came to Pharaoh to speak in your name, he has only made the condition of this people worse, and you have not delivered them." This was the peak of the intermediary's psychological drama. A man bringing light temporarily brings only darkness. But it was in this moment of despair that God revealed himself again, confirming his covenant with Abraham and promising that this time he would show his might not just as the God of the covenant, but as the warrior redeemer. The tension reached its limit. The battle of wills was over, and it was time for the battle of forces. Chapter 4. The 10 Plagues, Catastrophe, and the Ruin of a Theological Empire. The confrontation transitioned into a phase of a grandiose, sequential catastrophe, aimed not only at punishing Egypt, but at demonstrating the powerlessness of its gods and proving to the Israelites that their Yahweh was the one true existing one. Each plague was surgically precise, targeting the foundations of Egyptian faith and civilization. 1. Water became blood. The first blow fell on the symbol of life, the pride, and the deity of Egypt, the Nile. The life-giving river, the embodiment of the god Hapi, turned into a lethal, foul-smelling substance. The fish died, the river stank, and Pharaoh's priests, who worshipped the Nile, drank the disgusting, bloody liquid. This was the first, physical, and deeply symbolic humiliation of Pharaoh's power. His river god was not only powerless, but became a source of suffering. 2. Attack of frogs. Frogs, associated in Egyptian mythology with the goddess of fertility, Heket, who had a frog's head, overran everything. They came out of the Nile, entered homes and courtyards, settled in beds, ovens, and utensils. This was the disorder and filth that destroyed the cleanliness and order of Egyptian life, showing that the goddess of fertility could bring only chaos. 3. Insects and small animals, lice and flies. Invisible lice and persistent flies, covering people and livestock, were a blow to the purity of the Egyptian priests, who were obsessed with hygiene. This was a disaster that the magical powers of Pharaoh's wise men could no longer replicate. They were forced to admit, this is the finger of God. But Pharaoh refused to listen. 4. Wild wind brought livestock diseases. A deadly pestilence struck the Egyptian livestock, not only the economy, but also the deities depicted in animal form, for example, the god Apis bull. This plague, for the first time, drew a clear, unshakable boundary. The Israelite livestock remained untouched. 5. Disaster manifested in sores and suffering, boils and blisters. Moses threw ash into the sky, and it caused painful sores on people and animals. This was a direct mockery of the Egyptian healing gods, who could not protect even the priests themselves. The suffering became personal, unbearable. 6. Thunder and hail destroyed fields and crops. The sky, which the Egyptians considered their sanctuary, rebelled against them. God manifested his power over the forces of nature, over the goddess of the sky nut, and the god of weather shoe. Thunder and hail destroyed fields and crops, but again, in the land of Goshen, where the Israelites lived, there was peace and sun. 7. Locusts that consume, only after the 7th plague. Pharaoh, who almost let the people go after the hail, became enraged again. Locusts, a vast, countless army, arrived from the east to devour the little that remained of the fields. This was a complete economic collapse that even his servants begged him to stop. 8. Darkness covered the country for 3 days. This plague was the deepest psychological blow. 3 days of palpable, dense, paralyzing darkness enveloped Egypt, denying the sun god Ra, the greatest deity of the empire. People could not see, could not move. They were imprisoned in their homes, as if in stone tombs. At the same time, in Goshen, light reigned. This was a clear, visible separation, emphasizing that the God of Israel is the Lord of light and darkness. 9. Death of the firstborn, the last and most terrible. This plague was not only economic or natural, but metaphysical, retribution for the Israelite firstborn drowned in the Nile. Moses proclaimed, "At midnight the Lord will go through Egypt, and every firstborn will die." This was a strike at the future, at hope, at Pharaoh's own heir, who was considered a divine son. 10. Triumph of faith over pride and evil. This final plague was not just death, but the triumph of the will of the one who is. Pharaoh's heart, which resisted all previous plagues, was finally broken not by fear, but by personal, irreparable grief. His pride fell along with his son. This was the complete defeat of human self-exaltation before the justice of God. Chapter 5. Passover and Deliverance. The night of the boundary and the dawn of freedom. The night of Passover was a night when time stood still. The tension between life and death, between slavery and freedom, reached its climax. The Israelites, following meticulous instructions, celebrated the Passover, sensing the power of God's providence that had finally become physically manifest. The blood of the lamb, smeared on the doorposts, was not just a sign, it was the line of the covenant, a visible boundary set between them and the angel of death. In haste, standing with unleavened bread, with staffs in hand, they consumed this last meal in slavery, the bread of affliction, and the memory of deliverance. Their hearts beat between the unrestrained fear. of the terrible, impending event, and an elevated, almost frantic hope. They knew that on this night, their destiny was being decided in heaven and on earth, and precisely at midnight, when the Egyptian empire plunged into the deepest, most oppressive silence, a cry rang out. It was not one cry, but a million cries of sorrow that rose from every Egyptian house, from the slave's shack to the marble halls of Pharaoh. Death, invisible, relentless, and irreversible, took the firstborn from every family, including the heir to the throne. Meanwhile, the blood of the lamb on the Israelite doorposts served as an insurmountable shield. Pharaoh's fury was curbed not by strength, but by grief. His pride, which had resisted all previous plagues, finally broke before the corpse of his own son. He, who considered himself a god, was forced to acknowledge a higher authority. Pharaoh, broken and beside himself, commanded them to leave. He begged them to depart from his country, taking not only their people, but their blessing with them. Israel moved. It was not a peaceful march, but a great, chaotic, unrestrained exodus. 600,000 men, not counting women, children, and a large number of various people who joined them, left Egypt. They walked, burdened with gold, silver, and precious stones that the Egyptians, driven by fear, handed over to them. This was payment for 400 years of unpaid slavery, settled in a single night. Finally, the time of freedom arrived, a time when, instead of slave labor, they were led by a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night, the direct physical presence of God pointing the way. Their hearts beat between the euphoria of liberation and the fear of the unknown. Slavery was over, but the path to the promised land was just beginning. They left the land that had become a tomb for them and set off into the desert for a trial, for the formation of a free, unified nation. But the first obstacle, the Red Sea, was already awaiting them, and behind them, in furious wrath, rushed Pharaoh's chariots, who quickly regretted their decision to let the slaves go. This was the beginning of the grandest drama, which would conclude not only with physical exodus, but with the birth of the law